Edgar Cayce, known as the Sleeping Prophet, believed that life does not end with physical death. For him, death was simply a transition into another plane of consciousness, a return to the true home of the soul. Between the final breath and the moment the soul begins a new cycle, there is an interval, a period of passage he described as decisive for spiritual growth. Cayce taught that, immediately after leaving the body, the soul experiences both relief and disorientation. Relief, because there is no more pain or material heaviness. Disorientation, because the spiritual environment operates under laws entirely different from those of the physical world. He emphasized that this initial stage is deeply influenced by the choices, thoughts, and values cultivated during earthly life. For Cayce, this period was not a waiting room, but an active process. He described the soul reviewing in vivid detail the full impact of its actions. This is not an external judgment, but an inner awareness, as if every thought and deed returns with a clarity impossible to achieve while alive. Within what Cayce referred to as the 3 days of transition between death and rebirth, the first stage was one of adjustment. The soul learns to release material attachments and begins to recognize itself as part of a much greater reality. He noted that for many, this stage includes reunions with loved ones who have already crossed over, not as a comforting illusion, but as a natural result of vibrational affinity. On this first day, according to Cayce, there is no fear, but rather a deep recognition of one's own essence. It marks the beginning of a journey toward what he called the plane of spiritual lessons, where true learning begins. For Edgar Cayce, the moment immediately after death is a change of planes, not an end. He described this phase as an entrance into what he called the astral plane, an intermediate realm between physical life and full spiritual existence. This second stage, corresponding to the second day of the transition between death and rebirth, is when the soul begins adapting to a more expanded state of consciousness. In this plane, Cayce explained, the soul is no longer bound by physical time and space. Thought becomes the primary means of movement and communication. Wherever the mind focuses, the soul is there. Wherever the intention centers, the surrounding reality begins to shape itself accordingly. This freedom, however, comes with responsibility. Negative thoughts or unresolved emotions can still tether the soul to past experiences and unfinished matters. Cayce also said that during this period, the soul encounters what he called guides, higher beings whose role is to help the soul understand what has happened and prepare for the next step. These meetings are not about judgment or punishment, but about clarity. The soul, seeing truths it may have ignored, begins to accept the changes needed for growth. For those who cultivated love, kindness, and inner balance, this stage can be peaceful and uplifting. For those who lived in selfishness or anger, it can be challenging. Cayce emphasized that this is not divine punishment in the human sense, but rather the natural consequence of one's own actions and attitudes. The second day in this intermediate state is therefore a time of profound awareness. The soul realizes it cannot escape from itself, and to move forward, it must align with universal principles such as compassion, humility, and truth. In the third stage of the interval between death and rebirth, Edgar Cayce described an intense process he called the life review. Unlike symbolic or purely religious imagery, Cayce portrayed this moment as a direct encounter with one's own actions, thoughts, and intentions, not merely as memories, but as experiences relived from the perspective of all who were affected. According to Cayce, the soul feels with complete clarity the impact it had on others. If it gave love, it experiences that love multiplied. If it caused pain, it feels that pain as if it were its own. This is not punishment but an unavoidable realization, the full understanding that every act generates consequences that return to the one who created them. He taught that this mirror of the soul cannot be deceived. Masks, excuses, and self-justifications used in life lose all meaning here. In this state, the soul not only sees what it did, but also what it failed to do. For Cayce, this moment is crucial in determining the next steps in the spiritual journey, for it reveals with honesty the strengths and weaknesses of the spirit. The life review, he said, takes place in an environment of total spiritual lucidity. Many souls, Cayce noted, feel deep regret and a desire to make amends, influencing the kind of experiences they will face in a future incarnation. Others feel peace and gratitude, recognizing they have fulfilled their purpose well. Cayce also explained that this phase is accompanied by loving presences, sometimes family members, sometimes spiritual guides, whose role is not to judge, but to offer understanding and encouragement. This, he believed, is part of a divinely ordered system in which each soul receives exactly what it needs to continue its growth. Thus, the third day between death and rebirth is not silent, but revelatory. It is when the soul sees itself fully and decides consciously the direction of its next step on the path of evolution. After the period of review and self-understanding, Edgar Cayce described the soul entering a stage of preparation for the next chapter of its journey. For him, the cycle between death and rebirth was never random, but guided by universal spiritual laws. In this fourth stage, the soul evaluates what experiences will be most valuable for its continued growth. Cayce explained that this is not a time of idle rest, but of deliberate planning. Assisted by spiritual guides and more advanced beings, the soul examines the lessons it still needs to learn. He often said, "No soul is born by accident," emphasizing that every circumstance of a new life, from the body it inhabits to the family it enters, is chosen for the opportunities it provides. These choices are not made superficially. The soul considers unresolved karmas, latent talents that need development, and spiritual commitments from past incarnations. Cayce emphasized that reincarnation is not punishment, but a divine mechanism for learning and restoring balance. He also described that during this time, the soul begins to feel the pull of the physical plane again. It tunes in to the environment and circumstances it will enter. For some, the return is motivated by a desire to serve and uplift. For others, it is driven by the need to correct past mistakes. Cayce made it clear that even in this phase, free will remains intact, though it operates within spiritual laws that ensure nothing is imposed unfairly. Every choice has a reason, even when those reasons are not immediately apparent in physical life. Thus, the fourth day of this process is not the end of a spiritual journey, but the start of a new mission. The soul, now more aware of its nature and needs, accepts the challenge of returning to the material world for yet another chapter in its eternal evolution. According to Edgar Cayce, after the preparation and planning for the next life, the soul approaches the moment of transition back to the physical plane. He described this as crossing the veil, a passage where consciousness begins to readjust to the limitations of the human body. This stage marks the end of the cycle between death and rebirth and the start of a new chapter of learning. Cayce explained that this transition is gradual, not sudden. The soul, still free in the spiritual realm, begins to sense the density and slowness of physical time. It is like moving from total freedom to a narrower environment where the laws of the material world apply again. For him, this shift was not negative but necessary, because it is in the physical plane that lessons can be lived in practical ways. He also said that at this moment, the soul connects energetically to its future parents. This connection happens before conception or shortly after, depending on the circumstances and the soul's purpose for the incarnation. Cayce emphasized that this choice is not random, but based on spiritual affinities and the learning opportunities provided by that family unit. During this passage, the soul gradually loses full memory of the spiritual realm. According to Cayce, this spiritual amnesia is essential to ensure the earthly experience is genuine. If the soul remembered everything, it would not face life's challenges with the same intensity. This forgetting is thus a protective and growth-promoting mechanism. For Cayce, crossing the veil is an act of courage. The soul knows that physical life will bring joys and pains, victories and defeats, but it also understands that each experience is a necessary step toward growth. The fifth day is marked by hope and determination as the journey restarts with renewed purpose. Edgar Cayce described the final moment before rebirth as a profound spiritual silence. At this point, the soul, fully prepared and resolved, stands on the threshold between two worlds. This moment is not only physical, as in the instant of birth, but also energetic and conscious. Cayce said that in this stage, the soul is fully aligned with the reality awaiting it, yet it does not interfere with the free flow of events. It is a moment of complete surrender, where the future learning begins and the spiritual freedom gives way to the restrictions of physical matter. He described this silence as being full of potential, like the pause before a symphony starts. During this time, the soul is not alone. Spiritual guides and loving presences remain close, offering encouragement and protection. Although earthly consciousness won't recall this, the spirit carries an imprint of these blessings, an intuitive sense that it is never truly abandoned, even in life's darkest moments. Cayce also emphasized that the attitudes and decisions the soul will carry into its new life are influenced by the clarity gained during the spiritual transition. Seeds of virtue such as compassion, patience, and courage have been planted during this time, waiting for the right circumstances to grow. When the moment finally comes, the soul fully crosses the veil and anchors itself in the new body. The first breath of physical life echoes a much older commitment to continue learning, serving, and evolving. This closes the cycle that began with death and opens a new chapter where every experience will shape the soul's next return. In Cayce's view, the 3 days between death and rebirth are not strictly 72 hours, but represent 3 essential stages: liberation, understanding, and return. What happens in this interval shapes the entire soul's journey, revealing that life and death are simply different chapters of the same eternal story. If this journey through Edgar Cayce's vision of the soul's passage between death and rebirth moved you, imagine what other hidden truths and profound insights await here. Don't miss out on uncovering mysteries that challenge what we think we know about life, death, and the spirit. Subscribe now and join our community of seekers exploring the unknown, because the greatest discoveries happen when we open our minds and hearts. Hit that notification bell so you'll never miss a new video that could change your perspective forever. Your soul's next step might just begin here.